Most people remember Nora Aunor for the roles that changed Philippine cinema forever. The powerful performances, the unmistakable voice, the presence that could silence an entire room. But behind the spotlight, away from the cameras and applause, there's another story that rarely gets told.
Sorry. Inaano ko sana. Umaba lang ko sana.
It's a story not about awards or box office numbers, but about quiet moments that never made the headlines. Moments when she stepped in for someone who had nothing left. When she gave without expecting credit. When her generosity reached people who never imagined the country's biggest star would even know their name.
Writer siya, producer ako. Basta support lang ako ng support.
Some of these stories were shared years later, almost by accident. Others only surfaced after her passing, whispered by friends, co-workers, and people whose lives were changed in ways the public never saw.
Nag-apply ako. Ang in-applyan ko noon, PA.
Before we dive into those moments, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming uploads and stories like this. Because what comes next reveals a side of Nora Aunor that few ever truly knew. Behind every whispered story of her kindness was one choice that quietly shaped everything that followed. Nora Aunor often said fame could open doors, but family gave her life meaning. While the public watched her rise as a superstar, her private world was built around opening her home to children who needed more than just a place to stay. She rarely spoke about it. There were no headlines or photo ops. Those closest to her simply remembered how she treated every child like her own, making sure they felt seen, protected, and valued for who they were.
And maraming salamat sa mga tao pa rin naniniwala sa amin.
Visitors described a home filled with everyday noise, school papers on tables, laughter in the halls, late nights and early mornings. Inside those walls, she wasn't the superstar. She was Nane, the one who listened, worried, and stayed up when someone couldn't sleep. Her generosity went beyond support. She pushed them to build their own paths, reminding them her name could open doors, but their choices would decide what happened next. And while her home became a place of safety, it was only the beginning. Because soon, that same unexpected kindness would reach someone far outside her inner circle, leading to a moment people would remember for years. And it was in moments like those, far from her own home, that her kindness took on an even more unexpected form. One of the most talked about stories didn't happen on a film set or at a glamorous event. It happened during a time when someone close to her was struggling quietly, unsure of how to get through the next chapter of their life. According to friends, the situation wasn't dramatic enough to make headlines, but it was heavy enough to change everything for the person living it. Nora noticed. There were no long conversations, no public gestures, and no promises made in front of anyone else. She simply stepped in and offered help, the kind that doesn't come with a speech or a spotlight. It was a loan meant to cover a difficult period, given with the same calm, almost casual tone she used for everyday matters. What made the moment stand out wasn't just the help itself, but what happened after.
Patuloy pa rin po namin yon katulad ng mga ibang ginagawa ng mga grupo ng fans club.
Months later, when the person finally managed to pay her back, they approached her with relief, proud that they could return what they owed. Nora accepted the money without any fanfare. No lecture, no reminder of how hard things had been. Just a simple thank you, as if the whole thing had been nothing more than a small favor between friends. But that wasn't the end of it. Not long after, she quietly found a way to return the money, not as a loan and not as something that needed to be paid back again. It was given as a gift, wrapped in the same subtlety as the original gesture. No announcement, no explanation, just a message that said, in her own understated way, "You're okay now. Keep going." For the person on the receiving end, it wasn't about the amount. It was about what the moment represented. The idea that someone so famous, so busy, and so far removed from everyday struggles had paid attention enough to care, and then cared enough to let go of the debt entirely. Stories like this spread slowly. They didn't travel through press releases or interviews. They moved through conversations, through memories shared years later, often with a pause in the middle, as if the speaker was still trying to find the right words to describe how it felt. What made it even more striking was how Nora reacted when people tried to thank her publicly. According to those close to her, she would brush it off, change the subject, or even gently tease the person for making a big deal out of something she considered normal.
Alam ko lang, ang Boston lang yata ang gumagawa ng ganun.
To her, generosity wasn't a headline. It was a habit. But this quiet moment was only a glimpse of something much larger. Because as time went on, her desire to help didn't stay limited to one person, or even to her circle of friends. She began thinking about how to turn these small, personal acts into something that could reach people she would never meet. And that idea would soon grow into something far bigger than anyone expected. And that's when something shifted. What started as quiet, personal gestures began to take on a bigger shape, one that reached far beyond the people who could sit across from her and say thank you. Nora Aunor began to see her generosity not just as something you offered in private, but as something that could be built into a lasting system. A way to help people she would never meet, in places she might never visit, long after the moment had passed. This idea eventually led to the creation of the Nora Aunor Foundation, an effort that transformed her instinct to give in to something organized and far-reaching. Instead of single acts of help, there were now programs. Instead of one person at a time, there were communities.
This time, a duet from our superstar Nora Aunor and Gary Valenciano.
Those involved in the foundation later shared that Nora wasn't just a name attached to the project. She took an active interest in where the support went and who it reached. She asked questions. She wanted to know the stories behind the faces. For her, it wasn't enough to write a check and move on. She wanted to understand the lives being touched by the work. The foundation focused on helping those who are often overlooked, people facing financial hardship, limited access to education, or situations where even small assistance could change the direction of a life. Sometimes it was school supplies. Sometimes it was medical support. Sometimes it was simply making sure someone felt remembered instead of invisible. What stood out to those who worked alongside her was how she insisted on keeping things simple. No grand branding, no flashy campaigns. The goal wasn't recognition, the goal was impact. She believed that if the help truly mattered, the story didn't need to be loud. Over time, word began to spread, not through press tours or promotional events, but through the people who felt the effects firsthand. A family that could send a child back to school. Someone who could finally afford treatment they had been putting off. Small changes that carried a weight far greater than they seemed. Yet even as the foundation grew, Nora remained careful about how much attention it received. She would often redirect praise back to the volunteers and supporters, emphasizing that the work wasn't about her, but about what could happen when people came together for a shared purpose. To many, this was the most revealing part of her generosity. It wasn't just about giving. It was about creating space for others to give as well. But while this mission reached entire communities, there was another side of her kindness that never came with forms, applications, or official programs. Because even as her foundation worked quietly in the background, Nora continued to show up in everyday moments, in ways that surprised the people who crossed her path. And some of those encounters would become the stories fans and colleagues would hold on to the longest, long after the lights had faded and the stage had gone dark. And it was in those ordinary, unscripted moments that many people said they saw the most genuine side of her. Away from foundations and formal efforts, Nora Aunor had a way of turning everyday encounters into something people would remember for years. These weren't grand acts that made the news. They were brief, personal gestures that felt almost accidental, yet carried a weight far beyond their size. Colleagues from film sets and recording studios often shared stories of how she would notice the smallest details. Someone looking tired, someone unusually quiet, someone clearly worried about something they weren't ready to say out loud. Instead of offering advice or drawing attention, she would do something simple. A meal left on a table, a small envelope passed quietly, a gentle check-in that didn't demand an explanation.
Pinaghihimalaan, pinagmimilagruhan. And so, si Hilkito, ako, nagsimula kaming maglilibot.
One actor recalled how, during a long shoot, Nora would occasionally organize small raffles among the crew. Nothing extravagant. Just simple prizes meant to break the tension and remind everyone that they were seen, not just as workers, but as people. The mood on set would shift, even if only for a moment, and that moment was often enough to carry people through the rest of the day. Fans, too, told similar stories. Chance meetings in airports, outside theaters, or in quiet corners of restaurants where they expected a quick photo and maybe a polite nod. Instead, some walked away with conversations, with advice, or with a sense that they had been truly listened to, even if only for a few minutes.
Ewan ko kung maniniwala ang mga tao, pero bihirang tao o yung mga kaibigan ko lang.
What made these encounters stand out was how unguarded they felt. There was no sense of performance, no awareness of image. For a superstar who lived most of her life in the public eye, these moments felt strangely private, as if the fame had briefly fallen away. Over time, these small stories began to form a kind of informal history. Not written down, not archived, but passed from person to person. Each one slightly different, yet carrying the same theme. A reminder that kindness didn't always have to be organized or planned. Sometimes it just had to be noticed. And for many, these quiet interactions became the memories they held on to the longest. Not the movies, not the awards, but the moment she paused, looked at them, and made them feel like they mattered. But even these personal stories were only part of how people would eventually come to reflect on her life. Because when the tributes began to pour in, they revealed something even bigger, a pattern that connected all of these moments into a single, powerful legacy. Because when the tributes finally began to pour in, they didn't just talk about the roles she played or the records she broke. They talked about how she made people feel. As news spread and messages started appearing across social media, interviews, and quiet personal posts, a pattern emerged. Again and again, people described the same qualities: warmth, humility, and a generosity that didn't seem to fade no matter how high her fame rose. Directors spoke about how she treated crew members with the same respect she gave to leading actors. Musicians remembered her checking in on them backstage, asking about their families instead of their charts. Fans shared stories of chance encounters that turned into conversations they would never forget.
Writer siya, producer ako. Basta support lang ako ng support.
What stood out was how often these memories focused on moments that, at the time, probably felt small. A kind word, a thoughtful gesture, a decision to stay a few minutes longer when she could have walked away. At her necrological service, speakers didn't just list her achievements. They talked about the people she lifted along the way, the lives she touched quietly, without ever asking to be recognized for it. To them, her generosity wasn't a side note in her story. It was the thread that ran through all of it.
Nag-apply ako. Ang in-applyan ko noon, PA.
In a world that often celebrates success in numbers and headlines, Nora's legacy seemed to follow a different measure. It lived in gratitude, in memories passed down, in stories told not because they were dramatic, but because they were sincere. And for those who had only known her through a screen or a song, these tributes offered a new way to see her. Not just as a national icon, but as a person who chose again and again to notice the people around her. In the end, that may be the part of her story that lasts the longest. Because fame fades, performances end, applause dies down. But the moments when someone felt seen, helped, or understood, those have a way of carrying on, long after the spotlight has gone dark. And as those memories continued to surface, another layer of her generosity began to stand out. The way she treated the people who supported her from the very beginning. For many fans, meeting Nora Aunor wasn't just about getting close to a star. It became a moment they carried with them for the rest of their lives. Stories circulated of how she would stay long after events were supposed to end, even when security gently tried to move things along. Instead of rushing off, she would linger, signing autographs, listening to personal stories, and asking questions that went beyond simple pleasantries. Where are you from? How is your family? What are you hoping for next?
Parang nadurog yung aking puso. Parang hindi ako makapaniwala.
Some fans recalled bringing small, handmade gifts. Letters, drawings, simple tokens of admiration. Rather than accepting them with a quick smile and passing them off to an assistant, Nora would pause, look at them closely, and thank the person who made them, sometimes sharing a short story of her own in return. There were also moments that went far deeper than casual meet and greets. A few supporters spoke about times when she noticed someone in distress, someone overwhelmed, emotional, or struggling, and quietly stepped in. A private conversation, a reassuring word. In some cases, even small acts of help that were never meant to be shared publicly. What made these encounters so powerful was how personal they felt. Fans often said it didn't feel like they were talking to an icon. It felt like they were talking to someone who genuinely cared about the person standing in front of her, not the admiration they represented. Over time, these moments created a bond that went beyond fandom. People didn't just follow her work. They followed her life, her choices, and the values she seemed to live by.
Sorry. Inaano ko sana. Mamalang ko sana.
And as those supporters grew older, they became storytellers themselves, passing along these memories to the next generation. Because for them, Nora Aunor wasn't just a superstar on a screen. She was the person who stayed a little longer, listened a little more closely, and turned a brief encounter into something that felt like it mattered. And that sense of connection would play a powerful role in how her story continued to be told, long after the final curtain call. And when you step back and look at every story, every memory, and every small act of kindness, a clear pattern begins to form. Whether it was opening her home, helping a friend through a difficult time, building a foundation to reach strangers, or staying behind to listen to a fan, Nora Aunor's generosity didn't come from one big, dramatic moment. It came from a series of choices repeated over and over, often when no one was watching. To many, that's what made her different. The spotlight followed her everywhere, yet she seemed to move in the opposite direction, toward quieter spaces where she could simply be present for the people in front of her. In the end, these stories don't just tell us who she was as an artist. They offer a glimpse of who she chose to be as a person. Someone who understood that influence wasn't only about being seen, but about seeing others. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our future uploads.